The old man's hands trembled as he placed his worn veteran's cap on the counter, the diner's fluorescent lights harsh against his weathered face. "We don't serve your kind here," the manager sneered, loud enough for everyone to hear as he slid the menu away and motioned for security. The Vietnam veteran stood motionless, dignity intact despite the public humiliation, his eyes revealing a depth of suffering few could comprehend. No one in the packed diner raised a voice in his defense, just silent stares and uncomfortable glances at phones, but in exactly 15 minutes the rumble of military vehicles would shake the building's foundation, and every employee would find themselves standing on the sidewalk, watching as their replacements filed in with military precision. What connection did this forgotten hero have to the highest levels of the Pentagon that would bring an entire diner operation to its knees? Harold Mercer sat alone on the wooden bench outside Lenny's diner, his weathered hands clasped tightly together to hide their trembling. The morning sun offered little warmth against the chill that had settled into his bones, a chill that had nothing to do with the spring temperature and everything to do with what had just happened inside. He'd risen early that morning, as he did every day, the habits of military life still dictating his routine after all these decades. The small efficiency apartment he called home was clean but sparse, containing only the essentials and a few reminders of a life once lived in service. A shadow box with medals he never displayed publicly, a folded flag in a triangle case, a single photograph of young men in jungle fatigues, arms around each other's shoulders, faces still innocent of what was to come. Today was different. Today was the anniversary, 50 years since the day that had defined everything that came after. He'd put on his best button-up shirt, pressed meticulously the night before, and the only pair of slacks that still fit his diminished frame. The veteran's cap was a last-minute decision, something he rarely wore in public. But today he wanted to remember, needed to remember. The diner had seemed like the right place, affordable, quiet in late morning, a place where an old man could sit alone with his coffee and his memories. He never expected to be turned away at the counter, much less with such public disdain. The door to the diner opened, startling Harold from his thoughts. A young waitress, barely 20, with kind eyes, glanced nervously over her shoulder before approaching him. In her hands were a glass of water and a napkin-wrapped bundle. "I'm so sorry, sir," she whispered, extending the water. "I don't know what got into Mr. Gaines today. He's never done anything like that before." Harold accepted the water with a nod of thanks. "Not your doing, miss. No need to apologize." "I brought you a muffin, too," she said, offering the napkin bundle. "It's not much, but—" Harold's eyes crinkled at the corners, the closest thing to a smile he could manage. "That's mighty kind of you." As he reached for the muffin, his sleeve pulled back slightly, revealing the edge of a tattoo and a glimpse of the dog tags he wore beneath his shirt. The young waitress noticed, but said nothing. "I should get back inside before I get in trouble," she said, glancing again toward the diner. "What's your name, if you don't mind me asking?" Harold said. Jenny Simmons." "Thank you, Jenny Simmons." "Kindness means more than you know." She smiled and turned to go, then hesitated. "Can I ask, what unit were you with?" Harold's fingers reflexively moved to touch the dog tags beneath his shirt. 3rd Battalion, 5th Phase. Marines, 1968 to 71. Jenny nodded, though it was clear the designation meant little to her. "My grandfather was in Vietnam, too. He never talked about it." "Most of us don't," Harold replied softly. As Jenny hurried back inside, Harold noticed a man at the window, phone pressed to his ear, watching him intently. The man turned away quickly when their eyes met, disappearing back into the diner. Harold sipped the water slowly. He would wait a while, he decided, not because he expected anything to change, but because he had nowhere pressing to be. The bench faced east, toward the rising sun. A good place to remember fallen friends, even if it wasn't where he had planned to spend this solemn anniversary. He didn't notice the first black SUV that turned onto the street, moving slowly as if searching for an address. Nor did he pay much attention to the second vehicle that appeared from the opposite direction a minute later. It wasn't until the third and fourth vehicles arrived that Harold began to sense something unusual was happening. By then, the pieces were already in motion, set into play by a single phone call made by someone who recognized what so many others had missed. Inside Lenny's diner, the hands of the vintage Coca-Cola clock moved steadily toward 10:15 a.m. The breakfast rush had ended, and the staff had settled into the comfortable lull before lunch preparations would begin. The incident with the old veteran had already faded from most patrons' minds, replaced by conversations about weekend plans and local gossip. Lenny Gaines, the diner's manager and namesake son, wiped down the counter with swift, aggressive strokes. At 43, he had the perpetually harried look of a man who felt the world was constantly trying to take advantage of him. The diner had been his father's pride and joy, but to Lenny it was a burden, a daily reminder of expectations he could never quite fulfill. "That old man still out there?" he asked Jenny as she refilled the napkin dispensers. She nodded without looking up. "Yes, sir. If he's not gone in 5 minutes, call Officer Daniels. I don't want him loitering and scaring away the lunch crowd." Lenny's voice carried through the diner, ensuring everyone heard his authority being exercised. Jenny said nothing, continuing her task with downcast eyes. The elderly couple in booth 3 exchanged glances of disapproval, but remained silent. At 10:12 a.m., the man who had made the phone call, a middle-aged teacher named Michael Collins, checked his watch for the 5th time. He'd recognized the name on the old veteran's cap, though he could scarcely believe it. Harold Mercer was a name from his father's stories, a name mentioned with reverence and awe. If this was the same man, what was he doing alone, unwelcomed in a small-town diner? Michael had made a call to his cousin, who worked at the Veterans Affairs office in the city, just to check, just to be sure. At 10:13 a.m., the first black SUV rolled to a stop directly in front of the diner. Its government plates caught Lenny's attention, and he straightened up, automatically adjusting his tie. "Looks like we've got some suits visiting," he remarked to no one in particular, assuming they were state officials passing through. "Jenny, make sure the good coffee is ready." The second vehicle appeared from the east end of the street, followed almost immediately by a third from the west. All 3 were identical, black Chevrolet Suburbans with tinted windows and government plates. Otsuikom, 10:14 a.m. A fourth vehicle joined them, this one a military Humvee with full insignia displayed. It parked directly behind the first SUV, blocking one lane of traffic. "What the hell?" Lenny muttered, moving to the window for a better view. Outside, Harold remained seated on the bench, seemingly unaware of the commotion beginning to unfold around him. His eyes were fixed on some distant point, lost in memories only he could see. The doors of the lead SUV opened, and 2 men in impeccable military dress uniforms emerged. One wore the insignia of a full colonel, the other a commander. They surveyed. The scene briefly before their eyes settled on Harold. A look of recognition passed between them, followed by what appeared to be solemn reverence. At 10:15 a.m. exactly, the doors of the remaining vehicles opened simultaneously. Men and women in various military uniforms stepped out with precision and purpose. Some carried duffel bags and equipment cases. Others held tablets and communication devices. All moved with the coordinated efficiency that comes from years of disciplined service. Inside the diner, conversations had died away. Every face was now turned towards the windows, watching the scene unfold with confused fascination. "What's happening?" demanded an elderly customer, voicing what everyone was thinking. "Maybe it's some kind of training exercise," suggested another. Lenny's face had drained of color. "They're coming here," he said, watching as the colonel and commander approached the diner's entrance. "Why are they coming here?" Jenny, standing near the back, caught sight of Harold still sitting quietly on the bench. He had finally noticed the military presence, and for the first time that morning his posture had changed. He sat straighter, now shoulders back, head held high, the instinctive response of a man who had once lived by the code these uniforms represented. "I think," she said softly, "they're here for him." The bell above the door chimed as it opened, and the diner fell. Completely silent, Colonel James Wilson stood just inside the entrance of Lenny's diner, his presence commanding immediate attention. At 52, he carried himself with the quiet authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. His uniform bore the insignia of multiple combat deployments and the subtle indicators of special operations background. Beside him, Commander Thomas Reed surveyed the diner with calculated precision, mentally cataloging faces, positions, and potential variables. Neither man spoke immediately, allowing the weight of their unexpected arrival to settle over the room. Lenny Gaines recovered first, stepping forward with a forced smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Welcome to Lenny's, gentlemen. What can we do for you today?" Colonel Wilson's gaze fixed on Lenny, assessing him with the cool detachment of a man who had sized up more dangerous adversaries in far more hostile environments. "Are you the manager of this establishment?" His voice was measured, neither friendly nor overtly threatening. "I'm the owner," Lenny replied, emphasizing the word with a hint of defensiveness. "Lenny Gaines, this is my place." Wilson nodded once. "I see. Then you're the individual we need to speak with." He turned slightly to Commander Reed. "Secure the perimeter and prepare the team." Reed exited without a word, leaving Wilson alone with the increasingly nervous diner occupants. "What's this about?" Lenny demanded, his earlier bravado faltering under Wilson's unwavering gaze. Instead of answering, Wilson removed a leather credential wallet from his pocket and presented it. "Colonel James Wilson, United States Marine Corps, Special Operations Command. I'm here on official business concerning a matter of national importance." Lenny examined the credentials with growing confusion. There must be some mistake. This is just a diner in the middle of nowhere. "There's no mistake, Mr. Gaines." Wilson replaced his credentials and extracted an official-looking document from inside his uniform jacket. "This is a temporary requisition order, authorized under National Security Directive 1722 and signed by the Secretary of Defense." Outside, the activity had intensified. Military personnel moved with practiced efficiency, unloading equipment from vehicles and establishing a perimeter. Two Marines in full-dress uniform had approached Harold, standing at a respectful distance while appearing to engage him in conversation. Inside, Lenny scanned the document with increasing alarm. "This says you're requisitioning my diner? You can't do that. This is private property." "Actually, Mr. Gaines, I can, and I am." Wilson's tone remained professional, but left no room for argument. "This is a temporary measure, expected to last no more than 3 hours. You and your staff will be fully compensated for any loss of business, and the premises will be returned in the same or better condition than we found it." "This is insane," Lenny sputtered, looking around for support. "I'm calling my lawyer." "Feel free," Wilson replied calmly. "Though I should inform you that this operation has been cleared through all necessary legal channels, including local authorities. Sheriff Blackwood has been briefed and has given his full cooperation." The mention of the county sheriff, a man known for his no-nonsense approach and impeccable military record, visibly deflated Lenny's resistance. "What is this about?" asked an elderly customer, his curiosity overcoming his apprehension. Wilson turned to address the diner at large. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the interruption to your morning. What's happening here today is a rare activation of the Veterans Honor Protocol. I'm not at liberty to share all the details, but I can assure you this is both legal and for a worthy cause." Through the windows, patrons could see Commander Reed speaking with Harold. The old veteran remained seated, shaking his head slightly as Reed gestured toward the diner. "That old man?" Lenny asked incredulously. "This is about him? He's just some homeless vet looking for handouts." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees as Wilson's expression hardened. "That old man, Mr. Gaines, is Sergeant Harold Mercer, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, recipient of the Navy Cross and 2 Purple Hearts, and based on what I've been told occurred here approximately 20 minutes ago, you and your establishment have been selected for a lesson in respect and proper protocol. Wilson checked his watch with military precision. You now have exactly 5 minutes to brief your staff before we commence operations. I suggest you use that time wisely. Outside, Harold finally stood, reluctantly following Commander Reed toward the row of vehicles. His face registered a complex mixture of embarrassment and long-dormant pride as a young Marine corporal rendered a perfect salute. Lenny's 5 minutes passed in a blur of disbelief and hurried whispers. He gathered his staff, 2 cooks, 3 waitresses, including Jenny, and a dishwasher, in the narrow hallway leading to the restrooms, the only space out of direct view from the military personnel now stationed at every entrance. "This is crazy," he hissed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "They can't just come in and take over." "What did the old man do to deserve this?" asked Marge, the senior waitress who had worked at the diner since Lenny's father owned it. "Nothing," Jenny said quietly. "He didn't do anything except try to get breakfast wearing a veteran's cap." Before Lenny could respond, Commander Reed appeared at the end of the hallway. "Time's up, Mr. Gaines. Colonel Wilson requests your staff's presence in the main dining area." The staff filed out, confusion evident on their faces. In the 5 minutes they'd been sequestered, the diner had transformed. Military personnel now stood at attention near each entrance and window. 2 Marines had stationed themselves behind the counter, while others were efficiently rearranging tables in the center of the room. "All staff members, please line up, facing the entrance," Colonel Wilson instructed, his voice carrying the expectation of immediate compliance. Once they were assembled, Wilson addressed them directly. "For the next 3 hours, this establishment will be under the operational control of the United States Marine Corps Special Projects Division. During this time, your services will not be required." "You're kicking us out?" Lenny asked incredulously. "Not exactly, Mr. Gaines. You and your staff are welcome to remain as observers, provided you stay in the designated areas and do not interfere with operations. However, all operational duties will be performed by military personnel." As if on cue, the front door opened and 6 Marines in culinary uniforms entered, carrying equipment cases and food containers. "These are some of the finest military chefs in the country," Wilson explained. "They've served in embassies and prepared meals for presidents and foreign dignitaries. Today, they'll be running your kitchen." The military chefs moved with practiced efficiency, heading straight for the kitchen. Moments later, the sounds of Lenny's regular cooks protesting could be heard as they were politely but firmly escorted out. "This is insane," Lenny repeated, watching helplessly as his domain was systematically taken over. "You can't just replace my entire staff." "Actually, Mr. Gaines, that's precisely what we're doing," Wilson replied calmly. "Your waitstaff is being replaced by personnel with extensive experience in formal service protocol. Your cooks, as you've seen, are being replaced by military culinary specialists. Even your dishwasher is being relieved by a Marine who, I assure you, understands the concept of cleanliness on a level few civilians can comprehend." Outside the window, patrons could see Harold sitting in one of the SUVs. A female officer appeared to be speaking with him, occasionally gesturing toward the diner. Harold's expression remained one of reluctant embarrassment. Inside, the transformation continued. Crisp white tablecloths appeared, covering the worn Formica tables. Polished silverware and formal place settings replaced the diner's mismatched utensils. Somewhere, someone had found fresh flowers, now being arranged in simple but elegant centerpieces. The regular customers watched in fascinated silence, none making any move to leave. This was clearly becoming the most interesting thing to happen in town since the water tower collapsed during the winter storm of '98. "Your regular patrons are welcome to stay or leave as they choose," Wilson informed Lenny. "Those who stay will be served breakfast or lunch, compliments of the United States government. Those who leave will be given vouchers for a future meal here once normal operations resume." Not a single customer moved toward the exit. Jenny, standing slightly apart from the other staff, caught Wilson's attention. "Sir, What about the people who were waiting to be seated when you arrived? Wilson's expression softened slightly at her concern. They've been accommodated at the cafe across the street with their meals fully compensated. No one will go hungry today, I assure you. A commotion near the kitchen drew everyone's attention. One of Lenny's cooks was arguing loudly with a Marine, nearly twice his size. "This is my kitchen. You can't just walk in and take over." The cook's face was flushed with anger. The Marine remained professionally stoic. "Sir, please lower your voice. This is a temporary situation. Your kitchen will be returned to you in better condition than we found it." "Better condition?" The cook sputtered. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means," Wilson interjected, stepping forward, "that while they're here, my team will bring this establishment up to military standards of cleanliness and organization. Consider it a free professional deep cleaning service." The cook fell silent, his protest withering under Wilson's steady gaze. Outside, the door of the SUV finally opened, and Harold Mercer emerged, escorted by two Marines in dress blues. His weathered face showed a mixture of emotions: confusion, embarrassment, and something else. Something that looked almost like long-forgotten pride. Colonel James Wilson watched through the window as Harold Mercer approached the diner, flanked by the two Marines in dress blues. The sight stirred memories he'd kept carefully compartmentalized for decades. He straightened his already impeccable uniform and moved toward the entrance to meet them. Wilson had been just 8 years old when he first heard Harold Mercer's name. It was whispered reverently in his childhood home, mentioned in the same breath as phrases like "saved your father's life" and "never got the recognition he deserved." As a child, he'd imagined Harold Mercer as some kind of superhero, larger than life, invincible. The reality, this hunched, weathered man with trembling hands, was simultaneously disappointing and heartbreaking. But James Wilson knew better than most that heroes rarely resembled their legends. The door opened, and Harold hesitated at the threshold, visibly uncomfortable with the attention focused on him. The two Marines remained a respectful half-step behind, neither touching him nor rushing him, maintaining the perfect balance between escort and honor guard. Wilson stepped forward and rendered a precise salute. "Sergeant Mercer, Colonel James Wilson, United States Marine Corps. It's an honor to meet you, sir." Harold returned the salute automatically, muscle memory from another lifetime taking over. "At ease, Colonel. I'm not in uniform, and I've been a civilian for a long time." "Once a Marine, always a Marine, Sergeant," Wilson replied, the familiar motto carrying weight beyond its words. Harold's eyes narrowed slightly as he studied Wilson's face. "Wilson," he repeated, "any relation to Lieutenant Robert Wilson, 3rd Battalion, Delta Company?" A murmur ran through the watching crowd. Wilson nodded, his professional demeanor softening slightly. "My father, sir. He passed away 5 years ago." Something flickered across Harold's face, a complex emotion too quick to identify. "Bobby Wilson," he said softly. "Hell of an officer, one of the good ones." "He spoke of you often, sir," Wilson said. "Said you were the finest NCO he ever served with." Harold looked away, uncomfortable with the praise. "Your father exaggerated. We all did what we had to do." Wilson gestured toward the diner's interior. "Would you join me inside, Sergeant? There are some matters I'd like to discuss." As they moved into the diner, the transformed space elicited a small sound of surprise from Harold. White tablecloths, formal place settings, and military precision had replaced the casual diner atmosphere. The regular staff stood to one side, looking out of place in their own establishment. The customers remained, watching with undisguised curiosity. "What is all this?" Harold asked, his voice low enough that only Wilson could hear. "This is Operation Respect, Sergeant Mercer, a relatively new initiative activated in special circumstances." "For an old man who couldn't get breakfast?" Harold shook his head. "This is unnecessary, Colonel, a waste of resources." Wilson guided Harold to a table in the center of the room, positioned so he could see both entrances, a small consideration that didn't go unnoticed by the former combat veteran. "With respect, sir, I disagree. Nothing about this is unnecessary." As they sat, A young Marine approached with water and coffee, serving with the formal precision of a White House butler. Harold watched with a mixture of amusement and discomfort. "I don't understand any of this," he admitted after the server withdrew. Wilson leaned forward slightly. Soi Da Nang, March 17, 1969. Operation Defiant Stand. The change in Harold was immediate and profound. His back straightened, his eyes sharpened, and for a moment the decades fell away, revealing the Marine he had once been. "How do you know about that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Those records were classified. My father told me parts of it. The rest I pieced together after joining the Corps. It took some doing. A lot of the documentation from that period is still redacted, but I have certain clearances that helped." Harold's hands, which had been steadily trembling since the morning, grew suddenly still as they wrapped around his coffee cup. "Your father shouldn't have spoken about that day. None of us were supposed to. He only told me because I was shipping out for my first deployment," Wilson explained. "He wanted me to understand what real courage looked like. He told me about the hill, the radio, and what you did when the perimeter was breached." Harold closed his eyes briefly, the memories visibly washing over him. When he opened them again, they shone with unshed tears. 22 men died on that hill, Colonel, 22 better men than me, and 63 lived, including my father, because of what you did. Wilson's voice carried absolute conviction. The Navy Cross citation only tells part of the story. My father filled in the rest. For a long moment, Harold said nothing, lost in memories of a jungle hillside half a world away and half a century in the past. Around them, the diner had fallen. Completely silent, everyone sensing they were witnessing something profound. Finally, Harold looked up, meeting Wilson's gaze directly for the first time. "Your father was delirious from his wounds. Whatever he told you about me was filtered through fever and 50 years of distance." Wilson smiled slightly. "My father was many things, Sergeant Mercer, but never a man given to exaggeration, especially about the war." Before Harold could respond, the front door opened and Commander Reed entered, accompanied by a man in civilian clothes carrying a leather case. Reed approached their table with purpose. "Colonel, everything is in place? Dr. Summers has arrived with the package." Wilson nodded. "Thank you, Commander." He turned back to Harold. "Sergeant Mercer, I believe it's time to set some things right." Colonel Wilson stood, signaling to Commander Reed. The entire diner seemed to hold its breath as Reed moved to the entrance and opened the door with ceremonial precision. Outside, the remaining Marines had formed 2 perfect lines leading from the door to the street, standing at attention in their dress blues. "Sergeant Mercer," Wilson said formally, "with your permission, I'd like to invite you to join me outside for a moment." Harold hesitated, glancing around at the watching faces. "Colonel, whatever you're planning is long overdue," Wilson finished for him. "Please, Sergeant." With reluctant resignation, Harold rose from his seat. Wilson fell into step beside him, matching his pace to the older man's slower gait. As they approached the door, Harold paused, visibly steeling himself before stepping outside. The sight that greeted him made him stop in his tracks. Between the lines of Marines at attention stood Lenny's diner staff and the few remaining customers who had ventured outside, forming an impromptu audience. Behind them, townspeople had begun to gather, drawn by the unusual military presence. "What is all this?" Harold asked, his voice barely audible. Instead of answering directly, Wilson turned to address the assembled crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce you to someone. Many of you saw him earlier today as just another elderly veteran. Some of you," his gaze fell briefly on Lenny, "may have seen him as an inconvenience or an unwelcome reminder of difficult times. What you didn't see, what most people don't see when they look at our aging veterans, is the man behind the wrinkles and gray hair." Wilson turned back to Harold. "This is Sergeant Harold Mercer, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, on March 17th, 1969. Sergeant Mercer's unit was holding a strategic hilltop near Da Nang when they came under heavy enemy fire. When their position was overrun and their radio operator killed, Sergeant Mercer, despite being wounded in 2 places, fought his way to the radio and called in artillery support that saved 63 Marines, including my father. A murmur ran through the crowd. Harold stood straight-backed but uncomfortable, his eyes fixed on some distant point. For his actions that day, Sergeant Mercer was awarded the Navy Cross, our nation's second-highest military decoration. Due to the classified nature of the operation and Sergeant Mercer's immediate reassignment, that medal was never formally presented. Commander Reed stepped forward, carrying a polished wooden box. Wilson took it with white-gloved hands and turned to Harold. "Sergeant Mercer, on behalf of a grateful nation and the United States Marine Corps, I would like to formally present you with the Navy Cross that you earned through extraordinary heroism and unwavering devotion to duty." Harold's weathered face showed a complex mixture of emotions: pride, pain, embarrassment, and a deep, abiding sadness. "Colonel, this isn't necessary. With all due respect, sir, it is." Wilson opened the box, revealing the medal nestled on a blue velvet, a bronze cross suspended from a blue and white ribbon. "This has been waiting for you for over 50 years. A hushed silence fell over the gathering as Wilson carefully pinned the medal to Harold's simple button-up shirt. When he stepped back, he rendered a perfect salute, held for a 3-count hey do before dropping it. Harold stood motionless for a moment, then slowly returned the salute with military precision that belied his age and trembling hands. The crowd erupted in spontaneous applause. Several older men, likely veterans themselves, stood at a loose approximation of attention, paying their own form of respect. Jenny, watching from near the diner entrance, wiped tears from her eyes. Beside her, Lenny Gaines stared at the scene. With an unreadable expression, his earlier belligerence replaced by something that might have been shame. As the applause subsided, Wilson spoke again. "Ladies and gentlemen, Sergeant Mercer's story doesn't end there. Following his actions at Da Nang, he served in multiple classified operations, earning 2 Purple Hearts and saving countless American lives. After his discharge, he continued, serving his community as a volunteer firefighter for 15 years, once again putting his own safety at risk for others." Harold shook his head slightly. "You've done your homework, Colonel." "Actually, Sergeant, I've barely scratched the surface." Wilson turned back to the crowd. "What happened this morning, a decorated war hero being refused service at a local establishment, is unfortunately not an isolated incident. Every day across this country, men and women who sacrificed everything for our freedom walk among us unrecognized, often invisible to the very society they helped protect." Wilson's gaze swept the assembled faces, his expression solemn. "Operation Respect was established to address these incidents when they occur, but more importantly, to remind communities of the heroes living quietly in their midst." Harold cleared his throat. "Colonel, while I appreciate the sentiment, this is excessive. I'm just one old man." "No, sir," Wilson replied firmly. "You are not just anything. And with your permission, there are some people who would very much like to meet you properly." He gestured toward the diner, where several military personnel had emerged. Among them was a man in his 70s, wearing a Marine Corps veteran's cap similar to Harold's own. As the man approached, Harold's eyes widened in shock and recognition. "Thompson?" he whispered. "Danny Thompson?" The man smiled broadly. "Been a long time, Sarge." For the first time since the extraordinary events began unfolding, Harold Mercer smiled, a genuine smile that transformed his entire face, briefly revealing the young Marine he had once been. As Harold and Danny Thompson embraced, 2 old warriors reunited after decades, Colonel Wilson discreetly guided everyone back toward the diner. The moment deserved privacy, even amid the public spectacle that Operation Respect had created. Inside, Wilson addressed the gathered onlookers, his commanding presence naturally drawing attention. "I imagine many of you are wondering exactly what's happening here today," he began, his voice carrying easily through the diner. "Why would the United States military temporarily take over a small-town establishment over what might seem like a minor incident?" Lenny, standing uncomfortably near the counter, shifted his weight from foot to foot but remained silent. Operation Respect was established 3 years ago following a congressional investigation into the treatment of Vietnam-era veterans, Wilson explained. The findings were troubling. Men and women who served honorably during one of our nation's most divisive conflicts were still experiencing discrimination, disrespect, and isolation 50 years later. Wilson paced slowly as he spoke, making eye contact with various people around the room. The operation activates when we receive credible reports of a decorated combat veteran being publicly mistreated. Our response is proportional to the situation and designed to serve 3 purposes. First, to correct the immediate injustice. Second, to educate the community. And third, to recognize the veteran properly. "How did you even know what happened?" asked an elderly woman seated near the window. "It all happened so fast." Wilson nodded toward Michael Collins, the teacher who had made the phone call. Mr. Collins recognized Sergeant Mercer's name from his father's stories and made a call to verify his identity. Once confirmed, he contacted our hotline. Collins looked somewhat embarrassed by the attention. "My father served in Vietnam. He always told us to look out for his brothers in arms." From that initial call to our arrival took approximately 12 minutes, Wilson continued. We happened to have a team conducting training exercises at Fort Carson, about 30 miles from here. Once Sergeant Mercer's identity and service record were confirmed, the mission was authorized at the highest levels. Outside, Harold and Thompson were still deep in conversation, occasionally gesturing toward the diner or laughing at some shared memory. The years seemed to have fallen away from both men, their postures straighter, their expressions animated. "What exactly is this operation going to involve?" Jenny asked, her initial apprehension giving way to curiosity. "For the next 3 hours, this establishment will serve as a proper venue for recognizing Sergeant Mercer's service," Wilson replied. "Our culinary team is preparing a meal worthy of the occasion. Sergeant Mercer will be seated at the table of honor and served with the respect and dignity he has earned." He turned his attention to Lenny and his staff. "You are all welcome to participate as guests. In fact, I would encourage it. This isn't about punishment. It's about education and recognition." Lenny cleared his throat awkwardly. "And after the 3 hours, we depart, returning your establishment to you in pristine condition, along with compensation for any lost business." Wilson answered smoothly, and hopefully leaving behind a changed perspective. Through the window, they could see that Harold and Thompson had been joined by 2 more older men, also wearing veterans' caps. Handshakes and backslaps were exchanged with the awkward enthusiasm of men unaccustomed to displaying emotion. "Where did those other vets come from?" someone asked. "We made some calls," Commander Reed explained, speaking up for the first time. Word spreads quickly in the veteran community. When they heard one of their own was being honored, especially someone with Sergeant Mercer's record, they came. Wilson checked his watch. "We should proceed with the next phase. Commander Reed, is everything in place?" "Yes, sir." "The meal is being prepared, and additional guests have begun to arrive." As if on cue, 3 more vehicles pulled up outside, civilian cars this time, carrying families with children and elderly couples. Wilson nodded with satisfaction. "Sergeant Mercer's impact extends beyond his military service," he explained to the watching crowd. "As a volunteer firefighter, he saved 12 lives, including a family of 4 from a house fire in 1983. We've invited some of those people to join us today." Jenny stepped forward hesitantly. "Colonel, is there anything we can do to help? I feel like we should be doing something." Wilson considered her for a moment. "Actually, yes. If you're willing, we could use civilian servers alongside our military personnel. It would send a powerful message about community recognition." Jenny nodded immediately. "I'd be honored." "Me too," added Marge, the senior waitress. "I've been serving folks in this town for 30 years. I should have recognized him." When he came in, Wilson's expression softened slightly. "That's the heart of why we're here, ma'am. Too many veterans become invisible after their service ends. They walk among us unrecognized, their sacrifices forgotten. Outside, The small group of veterans had grown to nearly a dozen, spanning different ages and eras of service, all gathered around Harold with the unique camaraderie that only those who have worn the uniform can truly understand. "It's time to bring them in," Wilson said. "Let's show Sergeant Mercer that his country and his community still remember and honor his service." As the Marines moved to open the doors, Wilson added quietly, "And perhaps remind ourselves why such remembrance matters." Harold Mercer entered the diner surrounded by fellow veterans, his initial discomfort now tempered by the familiar presence of men who truly understood him. The transformation of the space momentarily stopped him in his tracks. What had been a simple small-town diner now resembled an officer's mess, with white tablecloths, polished silverware, and Marines in dress blues standing at attention. "This way, Sergeant Mercer." Colonel Wilson guided him to the center table, positioned where everyone could see and be seen. "This is your place of honor today." Harold shook his head slightly, but allowed himself to be seated. Danny Thompson took the chair to his right, while the other veterans arranged themselves at nearby tables. The regular diner patrons and staff were interspersed throughout the room, creating an unexpected blend of military and civilian. "I still don't understand all this fuss," Harold murmured to Thompson. "Then you never did understand your own worth," Thompson replied with a gentle elbow to Harold's ribs. "Some things never change." A young Marine approached with water and freshly brewed coffee, serving with ceremonial precision. Harold noticed the sergeant's stripes on his uniform and the combat action ribbon above his pocket. Not just a server, but a fellow warrior paying respect. "Thank you, Sergeant," Harold said quietly. "The honor is mine, sir," the young Marine replied before withdrawing with perfect military bearing. Colonel Wilson remained standing, surveying the room with quiet satisfaction before addressing the gathered crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, today we have the privilege of honoring Sergeant Harold Mercer, whose extraordinary courage under fire exemplifies the highest traditions of the United States Marine Corps. Before we begin our meal, I invite you all to stand for our national anthem." As everyone rose, 4 Marines in dress blues stepped forward. The a cappella rendition they delivered was hauntingly beautiful, their voices blending in perfect harmony. Harold stood at attention, his right hand over his heart, his eyes fixed on the small American flag that had appeared at the front of the room. When the anthem concluded, Wilson continued, "Please be seated. Our chefs have prepared a special meal for this occasion. Servers will bring each course with appropriate ceremony. This is not just a meal. It is a recognition of service and sacrifice." As if on cue, Marines and civilian servers, including Jenny and Marge, emerged from the kitchen with the first course. The military personnel moved with precision, while the diner staff followed their lead with growing confidence. The unlikely partnership created a service experience unlike anything the small town had ever seen. Harold watched in amazement as a bowl of soup was placed before him, with the flourish typically reserved for state dinners. "Butternut squash bisque, with creme fraiche and toasted pumpkin seeds," announced the server, a young female Marine with immaculate uniform and bearing. "Chef's specialty, sir." Similar announcements echoed throughout the room as each guest received their first course. The attention to detail was extraordinary, every place setting perfect, every server impeccably trained, every dish presented with respect and care. "When was the last time you had a proper meal, Harold?" Thompson asked quietly, noting how his old friend savored each spoonful. Harold shrugged. "I manage. That's not what I asked." Before Harold could respond, Jenny appeared at his side with a basket of fresh bread. "Sergeant Mercer," she said, her earlier nervousness replaced by sincere respect, "I want to apologize for what happened this morning. I should have done more." Harold's weathered face softened. "You brought me water and a muffin when no one else would." "Nothing to apologize for, miss." Jenny smiled, then lowered her voice. "I called my grandfather after you mentioned your unit. He was with the 7th Marines in '69. Said to tell you, Semper Fi." Semper Fi, Harold replied automatically, the Corps' eternal motto feeling both foreign and familiar on his lips after so many years. As Jenny moved on to the next table, Harold surveyed the room with quiet wonder. The diner had become something entirely different, not just in its physical transformation, but in the spirit that now filled the space. Where there had been indifference and casual cruelty just hours before, there was now respect, curiosity, and a growing awareness. The main course arrived with similar ceremony: perfectly cooked beef tenderloin, roasted vegetables, and duchess. Potatoes arranged with artistic precision and served simultaneously to every guest. The military chefs had transformed the diner's simple ingredients into a meal worthy of a five-star restaurant. This is the best meal I've had since... Harold paused, trying to remember. Since R&R in Bangkok 70, Thompson suggested, with a knowing smile. Harold chuckled. Maybe so. Across the room, Lenny Gaines watched the proceedings with a complex expression. Initially positioned near the door as if planning a quick escape, he had gradually moved closer, drawn by the palpable sense of occasion. Now he stood near the counter, observing Harold with undisguised curiosity. Colonel Wilson, noticing Lenny's attention, approached him quietly. "Something on your mind, Mr. Gaines?" Lenny started slightly. I've owned this diner for 15 years. That man's probably been in town the whole time. I never knew." "That's often the case," Wilson replied. "Our veterans, especially those who served in Vietnam, learned to keep their service private, too. Many came home to hostility rather than gratitude." "I didn't serve," Lenny admitted. "My father did, but I'd never..." Wilson nodded, understanding. "It's never too late to learn respect, Mr. Gaines." As the meal progressed, Harold seemed to transform before everyone's eyes. His shoulders straightened, his trembling hands steadied, and occasionally, when sharing a memory with Thompson or answering a respectful question from another guest, his face lit up with a smile that erased decades of weariness. As the main course dishes were being cleared, Colonel Wilson caught Commander Reed's eye and gave a subtle nod. Reed disappeared briefly, returning with a polished wooden case significantly larger than the one that had held the Navy Cross. A hush fell over the diner as Wilson moved to stand beside Harold's table. The other conversations died away as people sensed another significant moment approaching. "Sergeant Mercer," Wilson began formally, "earlier today we corrected a 50-year oversight by properly presenting you with the Navy Cross you earned in Vietnam. However, there remains another matter to address." Harold looked up with a mixture of confusion and wariness. "Colonel, you've done more than enough." "Actually, sir, we've only begun to set things right." Wilson gestured for Reed to step forward with the wooden case. "After reviewing your service record, those parts that have been declassified, we discovered several other decorations that were awarded but never presented." Reed placed the case on the table and opened it, revealing a display of medals nestled in blue velvet. Harold stared at them, his expression unreadable. "In addition to the Navy Cross," Wilson continued, "records indicate you were awarded 2 Purple Hearts, the Bronze Star with Combat Fui for Valor, the Vietnam Service Medal with 4 Bronze Stars, the Combat Action Ribbon, and the Vietnamese Cross of Gallantry." A murmur ran through the gathered crowd. Even the veterans looked impressed. This was no ordinary service record. "Due to the classified nature of your later operations and your immediate reassignment after Da Nang, these decorations were processed but never formally presented," Wilson explained. "Today, we finally complete that long overdue recognition." Harold reached out with slightly trembling fingers to touch the Purple Heart, the medal given for wounds received in combat. "I never wanted these," he said softly, "never asked for them." "That's why you deserve them," Thompson replied from beside him. "The ones who chase medals rarely earn the important ones." Wilson carefully lifted the Bronze Star from its place. "For extraordinary heroism in connection with military operations against an armed enemy, while serving with 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, Sergeant Harold Mercer distinguished himself by valorous actions on April 3, 1970, during a classified operation. near the Laotian border. Harold's eyes closed briefly at the mention of the date. Whatever had happened that day clearly still lived within him. Against overwhelming enemy forces, Wilson continued, reading from the citation, Sergeant Mercer led a counterattack that secured the extraction of 15 wounded Marines, repeatedly exposing himself to enemy fire to ensure no man was left behind. His courage and devotion to duty were in keeping with the highest traditions of the United States Marine Corps. Wilson pinned the medal to Harold's shirt beside the Navy Cross. The bronze star, with its distinctive V device, gleamed under the diners. Lights, a small piece of metal carrying the weight of extraordinary courage. One by one, Wilson presented the remaining medals, reading each citation in full. With each decoration, another piece of Harold's hidden history emerged, moments of bravery, sacrifice, and service that had gone unrecognized for half a century. Throughout the dining room, people listened in stunned silence. The elderly couple, who had witnessed Harold's initial rejection, wiped tears from their eyes. Jenny and the other servers stood transfixed, dinner rolls and water pitchers momentarily forgotten in their hands. In the back, Lenny Gaines had moved closer, his earlier defensiveness replaced by something approaching shame. He listened as Wilson described Harold's actions during a desperate firefight, how the sergeant had carried a wounded radio man through enemy territory, using his own body as a shield against incoming fire. As the final medal was presented, Wilson stepped back and rendered another formal salute. On behalf of a grateful nation and the United States Marine Corps, I thank you for your exemplary service and sacrifice, Sergeant Mercer. Harold returned the salute, his bearing now fully that of the Marine he had once been. When he lowered his hand, he cleared his throat before speaking. These medals don't belong to me alone, he said, his voice steady, despite the emotion evident in his eyes. They belong to the men who didn't come home, to the ones who gave everything. He looked around the room, making eye contact with each of the veterans present. We all carried each other. That's what the Corps taught us. No one fights alone. No one survives alone. Thompson placed a supportive hand on Harold's shoulder. And no one should have to remember alone either. That was our mistake, Harold. We all went our separate ways, carried our memories in isolation. Wilson nodded in agreement. Sergeant Mercer's experience sadly reflects that of many Vietnam veterans. They returned home to a nation divided over the war, often facing hostility, rather than gratitude. Many, like Sergeant Mercer, simply disappeared into civilian life, carrying their burdens silently. An older woman near the window raised her hand tentatively. When Wilson acknowledged her, she asked, "Did you know about his firefighter service too? After the war?" Wilson smiled slightly. "Yes, ma'am. After his discharge in 1972, Sergeant Mercer joined the volunteer fire department in Fairfield County. He served for 15 years, earning commendations for bravery on multiple occasions, including the rescue of a family of 4 from a house fire in 1983. That was my sister's family," the woman said, her voice thick with emotion. "We never knew he was a war hero too." Harold shook his head. "I wasn't a hero, ma'am. Not in the war, not after. Just doing what needed doing." "With respect, Sergeant," Wilson replied. "That's precisely what makes someone a hero, doing what needs to be done, regardless of personal cost or recognition." As Wilson spoke, Commander Reed approached and whispered something in his ear. Wilson nodded and turned back to the gathering. "Ladies and gentlemen, I've just been informed that several members of Sergeant Mercer's former platoon have arrived. With your permission, Sergeant, I believe they're quite eager to see you." Harold looked momentarily overwhelmed, but nodded his consent. As Wilson moved to the door, Harold whispered to Thompson, "How many of us are left?" "More than you'd think." Thompson replied with a smile, "And they've all been looking for you for a very long time." The diner's door opened, and 5 men entered, all in their 70s, all bearing the unmistakable posture of former Marines despite the decades of civilian life. They paused just inside, scanning the room until their eyes found Harold. For a moment, no one moved or spoke, the weight of 50 years hanging in the air between them. Then the tallest of the group, A lean man with silver hair and a deeply lined face stepped forward. "Hey, Sarge," he said simply, his voice rough with emotion. Harold stood slowly, staring in disbelief. "Martinez? John Martinez?" The man nodded, a smile breaking across his weathered face. "Been a long time." Harold moved around the table with surprising speed for a man his age, embracing Martinez with the fierce affection of brothers who had faced death together. One by one, he greeted each of the others: Cooper, Rodriguez, Williams, Peterson, names that had lived only in his memory for half a century, now attached once again to flesh and blood. Colonel Wilson discreetly directed the servers to bring coffee and dessert, giving the reunited platoon members space for their reunion while ensuring the event continued smoothly. Throughout the diner, conversations resumed at a respectful murmur, occasionally punctuated by laughter or exclamations from Harold's table as old stories were revisited. After several minutes, Martinez raised his voice slightly. "Sarge, we've been looking for you for years. After the last operation, you just disappeared." Harold's expression grew somber. "Seemed better that way." "For who?" Cooper asked. "Not for us. We thought you were dead until Thompson here tracked down your discharge papers in '98. Harold glanced at Thompson, who shrugged unapologetically. "I tried to find you then, but you'd gone off-grid pretty thoroughly." "Why, Harold?" Williams asked quietly. "After everything we went through together, why disappear?" The diner had fallen silent again, everyone listening intently. Harold looked around, suddenly aware of his audience, and seemed ready to deflect the question. But something in the open, respectful faces surrounding him made him reconsider. "After that last mission," he began slowly, "the one near the Laotian border, I couldn't reconcile what we'd done, what I'd done, with coming home and being treated like it never happened, like none of it mattered." He paused, collecting his thoughts. "We lost Jennings and Kovich that day, good men, and for what? 2 weeks later, we were pulling out of the whole region anyway." The veterans around him nodded understanding. They had all lived through the chaos and futility of the war's final stages. "When I got back stateside," Harold continued, "people either treated us like criminals or ignored us entirely. My own brother told me I should be ashamed of wearing the uniform." Martinez shook his head. "I remember those days. Took my uniform off on the plane home, changed into civilian clothes, didn't want the hassle. I couldn't adjust," Harold admitted. "Nightmares, flashbacks, what they call PTSD now, but back then it was just combat fatigue, and you were supposed to suck it up." He looked down at his hands. "I started drinking, lost my first job, then my marriage. By 75, I was pretty much at rock bottom." Colonel Wilson, listening nearby, nodded slightly. This was the untold story of countless Vietnam veterans, the invisible wounds they carried home from a controversial war. "What happened then?" Jenny asked gently from where she stood nearby, clearly invested in Harold's story. "Fire," Harold said simply. "Apartment building where I was staying caught fire. I got out, but there were others still inside. Something clicked, and suddenly I was back in the jungle, pulling my guys out under fire. Only this time, it was civilians from burning rooms." He shrugged. "Fire chief afterward asked if I'd ever considered joining the department. Said I had. Good instincts. First time since coming home that anyone had suggested I might be good for something." "You saved lives," Thompson said. "That's what you always did, Harold. In the jungle or in a burning building, you saved lives." Harold nodded slowly. "Firefighting made sense to me. Clear objective. Go in. Get people out. Put the fire down. No politics, no gray areas. Just do the job. But you never reached out to any of us," Rodriguez pointed out. "Never came to any reunions." "Couldn't face it," Harold admitted. "Couldn't face you all. I left Jennings and Kovich behind that day. Command said we had to move, but I was squad leader. I should have found a way. That's what this has all been." "About?" Martinez asked incredulously. "Harold, we were overrun. Artillery was dropping. The choppers were taking fire. If you hadn't ordered us to move when you did, none of us would have made it out." "Martinez is right," Cooper added. "You made the only call you could, and before you did, you went back twice under heavy fire trying to reach them." Williams leaned forward, Jennings was already gone, Sarge. I was the last one to see him. And Kovich knew the score. He was covering our withdrawal. That was his choice. Harold shook his head, unconvinced despite their reassurances. The guilt he had carried for 5 decades wasn't easily dismissed. Is that why you've been alone all these years? Thompson asked gently. Some kind of self-punishment? Harold didn't answer directly, but his silence was confirmation enough. Well, that ends today, Martinez declared firmly. We found you, Sarge, and this time, we're not letting you disappear again. Around the diner, people listened with newfound understanding. The elderly veteran they had seen rejected that morning was being revealed as someone far different from their initial assumptions. A man who had carried the weight of war and loss for 50 years, who had continued to serve his community even while battling his own demons. From his position near the counter, Lenny Gaines watched the reunion with conflicting emotions churning inside him. The military precision, the medals, the obvious respect these men commanded, it all stirred something he'd spent decades trying to suppress. Memories of his father, also a Vietnam veteran, flooded back unbidden. Leonard Gaines Sr. had returned from the war a changed man, bitter, volatile, prone to nightmares that would wake the household with his screams. As a child, Lenny had learned to fear the vacant look that would sometimes appear in his father's eyes, the 1,000-yard stare that meant Dad had gone somewhere else, somewhere terrifying. Unlike Harold Mercer, Leonard Sr. had found no redemption in service to others. Instead, he'd sought escape in alcohol, gradually withdrawing from family and community until the day 10-year-old Lenny came home from school to find police cars in the driveway and his mother sobbing on the porch. His father had finally silenced his demons with his service pistol. The diner, originally opened by his grandfather, had eventually passed to Lenny after his mother's death. He'd taken over with grand plans to restore it to its former glory, to make it a community gathering place his grandfather would have been proud of. But over the years, financial struggles and personal bitterness had eroded those dreams. The diner, like Lenny himself, had gradually become a harder, less welcoming version of what it was meant to be. Mr. Gaines? Colonel Wilson's voice startled Lenny from his thoughts. Yes? You've been watching Sergeant Mercer quite intently, Wilson observed. Something on your mind? Lenny hesitated, unaccustomed to sharing personal matters. My father was in Vietnam, too. 25th Infantry Division. Understanding dawned in Wilson's eyes. Did he talk about it much? Never, Lenny replied. Not directly. But it was always there, this darkness he carried? Wilson nodded. Many did, still do. He killed himself when I was 10, Lenny continued, surprising himself with the admission. I always blamed the war, blamed the military for what it did to him. I'm sorry about your father, Wilson said quietly. That generation of veterans faced challenges most of us can barely comprehend. They fought in an unpopular war, then returned to a nation that largely rejected them. Mercer seems different, Lenny observed, glancing toward Harold's table where the reunited Marines were, sharing stories, their animated faces, decades younger in the glow of rekindled brotherhood. Different choices, different outcomes, Wilson suggested, but they all carried similar burdens. Some found ways to bear the weight, others were crushed by it. Lenny watched as Harold laughed at something Martinez said, a genuine, unguarded moment of joy. I treated him like garbage this morning, he admitted, the shame of it burning in his chest. Yes, you did, Wilson agreed, offering no easy absolution. I saw the hat and the age and I saw my father, I guess. All that anger and pain walking through my door. Wilson considered this. That's understandable on a personal level, but as a business owner serving the public, I know, Lenny cut him off. I know what I did was wrong. I've spent my whole life trying to get away from what the war did to my family. And yet, here you are, having this conversation in the middle of Operation Respect, Wilson observed with a slight smile. Life has a way of bringing us full circle to face the things we need to address. Across the room, Harold was now showing something to his former squad members. a worn photograph extracted carefully from his wallet. The men leaned in, pointing and nodding, identifying younger versions of themselves captured in a moment from half a century ago. "What happens now?" Lenny asked. "After you all leave, I mean." "That depends largely on you, Mr. Gaines," Wilson replied. "Operation Respect creates a moment of recognition and education, but its lasting impact depends on how communities respond." "Afterward," Lenny nodded slowly, a decision forming. "I need to talk to him, to apologize properly." "I believe that would be appropriate," Wilson agreed. "Will he even want to hear it?" Wilson studied Lenny thoughtfully. "Sergeant Mercer spent 15 years running into burning buildings to save strangers. I suspect he has a capacity for forgiveness that might surprise you." Lenny straightened his shirt and smoothed his hair nervously. "I'll wait for the right moment." "A wise approach," Wilson said, checking his watch. "We have approximately 1 hour remaining in our official operation. Perhaps when things quiet down." As Wilson moved away to confer with Commander Reed, Lenny continued watching Harold and his reunited squad. Their camaraderie was palpable, a bond forged in circumstances most civilians could never fully comprehend. For the first time, Lenny found himself wondering what his father might have been like if he'd maintained connections with his war brothers, if he'd found purpose after the trauma, as Harold had with firefighting, if he'd had an Operation Respect moment instead of decades of silent suffering. Jenny approached, coffee pot in hand. "Refill, Mr. Gaines?" Lenny nodded absently, still watching Harold's table. "I really messed up this morning, didn't I?" Jenny considered her words carefully. "Yes, but you're not the first. My grandfather said when he came home from Vietnam, he couldn't even get a job interview once people saw Marine Corps on his application." "That's awful," Lenny said. It was. But he always said it wasn't about dwelling on past wrongs. It was about doing better once you knew better. She poured his coffee with steady hands. "Maybe that's what today is really about." Lenny took a sip of the coffee, better than anything his diner usually served, he had to admit. Across the room, Harold was listening intently as Williams told a story, his weathered face animated with attention and respect. In that moment, Lenny made a decision. He would speak to Harold Mercer before this extraordinary day ended. And regardless of how that conversation went, things at Lenny's diner would change. It was time to honor his grandfather's original vision, a place where everyone, regardless of background or circumstance, was welcomed with dignity and respect. As the dessert plates were cleared and coffee was served, a natural lull fell over the gathering. Harold's former squad members had settled into comfortable conversation, occasionally including others nearby in their reminiscences. The atmosphere had transformed from the formal ceremony of earlier to something warmer and more intimate, a genuine community forming around the shared experience. Colonel Wilson caught Lenny's eye and gave a subtle nod toward Harold's table. The moment Lenny had been waiting for had arrived. Taking a deep breath to steady himself, Lenny approached Harold's table. The conversation among the veterans quieted as they noticed his approach, their expressions guarded but not hostile. "Sergeant Mercer," Lenny began, his voice rougher than he intended. He cleared his throat and tried again. "Mr. Mercer, I wonder if I might have a word with you." Harold looked up, his face unreadable. After a moment's consideration, he nodded. "Of course." Lenny glanced at the other veterans. "Privately, if possible." Martinez started to protest, but Harold raised a hand. "It's fine, John." To Lenny he added, "Lead the way." They moved to a small table near the window, away from the main gathering but still visible to everyone, including Colonel Wilson, who watched with measured interest. Once seated, Lenny found the carefully rehearsed speech dissolving in his mind. Instead, he simply said, "I behaved inexcusably this morning. I want to apologize." Harold studied him for a moment before responding. Apology accepted. The simplicity of the response caught Lenny off guard. He had expected, anger, resentment, demands for explanation? But Harold's straightforward acceptance seemed to demand honesty in return, My father was in Vietnam, Lenny found himself saying. 25th Infantry. He didn't adjust well when he came home. Harold's expression softened with understanding. Many didn't. He killed himself when I was 10, Lenny continued, the words coming easier now. I've carried that with me my whole life. When I saw your hat this morning, something just triggered all that old anger. Harold nodded slowly. The war followed us home in different ways. I'm sorry about your father. I'm not telling you this as an excuse, Lenny clarified. There is no excuse for how I treated you. I'm telling you because I want you to understand that it wasn't about you personally. I never thought it was, Harold replied. Few things in life are truly personal, even when they feel that way in the moment. Lenny was struck by the simple wisdom in those words. Still, I was wrong, and I'm sorry. As I said, apology accepted. Harold gestured around the transformed diner. Though all this seems like overkill for a simple misunderstanding. Was it, though? A misunderstanding? Lenny asked. Or was it exactly what it looked like? A prejudice against someone based solely on their veteran status? Harold considered this. Perhaps a bit of both. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the morning's events and the day's revelations settling between them. Outside the window, more townspeople had gathered, drawn by word spreading about the unusual military presence at Lenny's diner. Your diner was your father's before you? Harold asked, changing the subject. Lenny shook his head. My grandfather's. Dad never wanted anything to do with it. After he died, Mom ran it until she passed. Then it came to me. And you kept his name on it. Lenny's seemed right somehow. Connect to something positive from my childhood, I guess. Harold nodded, understanding. Connections matter. Roots matter. He glanced toward his reunited squad. I forgot that for a long time. I'd like to make something right, if you'll let me, Lenny said. When all this is over, when things go back to normal, I want you to know you're welcome here, anytime, on the house. Harold shook his head. I appreciate the gesture, but I don't want special treatment, just the same respect you'd show any customer. Fair enough, Lenny agreed. But the offer stands. He hesitated, then added, and maybe you could bring your friends sometimes. I'd like to hear more of your stories. Something in Harold's expression shifted, a guardedness giving way to cautious hope. I'd like that. Might do us all some good to talk more. Remember together instead of alone. From across the room, Thompson caught Harold's eye and raised an eyebrow in question. Harold gave a small nod, indicating all was well. They're protective of you, Lenny observed. We protected each other. Old habits. Harold's gaze returned to Lenny. About your father. Have you ever connected with other veterans from his unit? They might have known him, might be able to share memories from before the darkness took over, Lenny finished for him. No, I never thought to try. Wouldn't know where to start. I might, Harold said, if you're interested. The 25th. Had some reunions over the years. Thompson keeps track of that sort of thing. The unexpected offer of help from a man he had mistreated just hours earlier left Lenny momentarily speechless. Yes, I think I'd like that. Harold nodded once. Matter settled. We'll talk about it later, then. Colonel Wilson approached their table, his expression neutral but his eyes alert, assessing the situation. Everything all right here? Yes, Colonel, Harold replied. Mr. Gaines and I were just clearing the air. Wilson nodded approvingly. Good. We'll be wrapping up operations soon. Commander Reed asked me to inform you that several local reporters have arrived outside. They're requesting interviews. Harold's expression clouded. I'm not interested in publicity. Understood, sir? We can arrange a discreet exit if you prefer. Lenny surprised himself by speaking up. Or you could stay. Use the back office if you want privacy, but maybe your story should be told. Maybe it would help others, veterans who've been invisible too long, or people like me who needed their perspective adjusted. Harold considered this, looking between Wilson and Lenny. Finally he sighed. One reporter, no photographs, and my squad brothers are included if they want to be. Wilson smiled slightly. Very good, Sergeant. I'll make the arrangements. He turned to go, then paused. And Mr. Gaines? Well done. As Wilson moved away, Lenny realized something had shifted. not just in how he viewed Harold Mercer or veterans in general, but in how he viewed himself and his own capacity for change. The burden of anger he had carried since childhood felt lighter somehow, not gone, but less defining. "I should get back to my friends," Harold said, rising from his seat. "They still have decades of stories to catch me up on." "Of course," Lenny replied, standing as well. He extended his hand. "Thank you for hearing me out." Harold shook the offered hand firmly. "Thank you for making it right." Word traveled fast in small towns. By early afternoon, a crowd had gathered outside Lenny's diner, drawn by rumors of military vehicles, formal ceremonies, and a local veteran receiving long overdue recognition. People brought chairs and coolers, settling in on the sidewalk and in the small park across the street, creating an impromptu community gathering. Inside, Harold had agreed to speak with one reporter, a thoughtful woman from the county newspaper who asked respectful questions and listened more than she wrote. His squad members contributed to the story, filling in details Harold was too modest to share, creating a more complete picture of the man and his service. "I understand you've been living in town for almost 20 years, the reporter said. "In all that time, did anyone recognize you or acknowledge your service?" Harold considered the question. "A few. The VA clinic staff, of course. A couple of older veterans who recognized the signs, but mostly I kept to myself. By choice? Initially," Harold admitted. "Later, it just became habit. Easier to be invisible than to explain." The reporter nodded, understanding. "And today's events, how do you feel about all this attention?" Harold glanced around at the transformed diner, at his reunited squad members, at the Marines still standing at formal attention near the doors. "Uncomfortable," he said honestly, "but also healing in a way I didn't expect." Outside, the crowd had continued to grow. Mayor Patterson had arrived, hastily drafting a proclamation on town letterhead declaring it Harold Mercer Day in the small community. The high school band director had gathered available students who now played patriotic songs in the park. Someone had erected a small platform for impromptu speeches. Commander Reed entered the diner and approached Colonel Wilson. "Sir, the situation outside is evolving. The crowd is entirely supportive, but significantly larger than anticipated. Local authorities are requesting guidance on how to proceed." Wilson checked his watch. "Our scheduled operation concludes in 20 minutes. What's your assessment, Commander?" "The community has essentially created their own extension of Operation Respect," Reed replied. "It would be counterproductive to shut it down." Wilson nodded agreement. "Coordinate with local authorities to maintain order, but let the community response develop naturally, and check with Sergeant Mercer. Ensure he's comfortable with continuing." Reed saluted and departed to carry out his instructions. Nearby, Jenny approached Lenny with uncharacteristic directness. "Mr. Gaines, I have an idea." Lenny, still processing his conversation with Harold, looked up distractedly. "What's that?" "When the military leaves, we should keep this going somehow. Make the diner a place that honors veterans, not just today, but every day." The suggestion caught Lenny off guard, but as he considered it, a sense of rightness settled over him. "What are you thinking? A wall of honor, maybe? Photos of local veterans? And maybe a discount for service members?" Jenny's enthusiasm grew as she spoke. "My grandfather would have loved a place where he could connect with other vets." Before Lenny could respond, the diner's door opened, and Mayor Patterson entered, looking important in his Sunday suit, despite the hastily knotted tie. He made a beeline for Harold's table. "Sergeant Mercer," he announced loudly, hand extended. "Jim Patterson, town mayor. On behalf of our entire community, I want to extend our deepest gratitude for your service and our sincere apologies for the oversight of not recognizing you sooner." Harold stood politely but looked uncomfortable with the mayor's effusive greeting. "Thank you, sir, but that's really not necessary." "Nonsense. It's absolutely necessary," the mayor insisted. "In fact, I've prepared a proclamation declaring today Harold Mercer Day throughout our town. We're planning a ceremony in the park in about an hour, and I'd be honored if you'd say a few words." Harold shot a desperate look toward Colonel Wilson, who smoothly intervened. Mayor Patterson, while your enthusiasm is commendable, Sergeant Mercer has already participated in several ceremonies today. Perhaps a more modest acknowledgement would be appropriate. The mayor looked disappointed, but quickly rallied. Of course. Well, at minimum, we'd like to present the proclamation. The whole town's gathering to honor one of our own. As the mayor continued detailing his plans, more townspeople entered the diner. An elderly man with a VFW cap, a middle-aged woman carrying a homemade cake, 3 teenagers with hand-drawn thank you cards. Each made their way to Harold, offering thanks, sharing stories of their own family members who had served, creating connections that had been absent for decades. Thompson leaned close to Harold. Quite a change from this morning, eh? Harold nodded, clearly overwhelmed by the attention, but making a genuine effort to engage with each person who approached. Bit much, he admitted quietly. You deserve it, Sarge, Martinez said from his other side. Hell, you deserve more. Outside, someone had hung a large American flag from the lamppost in front of the diner. A woman was distributing small flags to children in the crowd. The high school band had been joined by a church choir, creating an impromptu patriotic concert in the park. Colonel Wilson watched it all with measured satisfaction. Operation Respect had been designed precisely for this outcome, not just to correct individual incidents of disrespect, but to catalyze community awareness and recognition. The transformation occurring in this small town was among the most profound he had witnessed in the program's 3-year history. Your 3 hours are nearly up, Colonel, Commander Reed noted, returning from his coordination with local authorities. Shall I begin withdrawal procedures? Wilson considered the scene thoughtfully. I believe our official mission is complete, Commander, but let's ensure a smooth transition. Station 2 Marines to remain with Sergeant Mercer as long as he wishes, and have the others withdraw gradually, rather than all at once. Yes, sir, Reed replied. And the diner itself? Return operational control to Mr. Gaines, but leave the enhancements in place if he's amenable. I believe he may have plans of his own. Reed saluted and moved away to implement the orders. Wilson turned his attention back to Harold, who was now listening intently to an elderly woman describing how her late husband, also a Vietnam veteran, had always regretted not speaking more about his experiences before Parkinson's disease took his voice. The transition of control back to Lenny and his staff proceeded with the same military precision that had characterized the entire operation. Marines withdrew gradually, each pausing to shake Harold's hand before departing. The military chefs emerged from the kitchen to present Lenny with a detailed inventory of supplies used and a folder containing recipes they had prepared. Your kitchen has been thoroughly cleaned and reorganized according to professional standards, the head chef explained, handing over the folder. We've also taken the liberty of labeling everything and creating a more efficient workflow. I hope you don't mind. Lenny leafed through the documents with growing amazement. This is incredibly helpful, actually. Thank you. The chef nodded. Formally, yeah. It was our honor to serve today. By late afternoon, most of the military presence had departed, leaving only Colonel Wilson, Commander Reed, and 2 Marines in dress blues, who remained discreetly near Harold. The impromptu community celebration continued outside, with Mayor Patterson holding court from the small platform, regaling the crowd with stories of the town's military history, much of it clearly researched hastily on his phone during the past hour. Inside, Lenny gathered his staff near the counter. I want to thank you all for adapting so well to this unusual situation, he began awkwardly, unaccustomed to expressing gratitude. Today has been eye-opening for me. For all of us, Marge agreed, the senior waitress nodding thoughtfully. I've served Harold coffee a few times over the years, never knew a thing about him. That's going to change, Lenny said with newfound determination. This diner was my grandfather's pride. He built it as a place where everyone in the community would feel welcome. He paused, gathering his thoughts. Somewhere along the way, I lost sight of that. Jenny stepped forward. Mr. Gaines, I've been thinking about what I said earlier, about making this a place that honors veterans. "I've been thinking about that too," Lenny replied, "and I want to do it right." He turned to Colonel Wilson, who stood nearby. "Colonel, would you have any recommendations for how a small business like ours could better serve veteran customers?" Wilson considered the question thoughtfully. "Recognition is the most important element, Mr. Gaines. Not necessarily discounts or special treatment, though those are appreciated. What most veterans seek is simply acknowledgement of their service and a welcoming environment." "A wall of honor would be a good start," Jenny suggested again. "Photos of local veterans, maybe some memorabilia, and staff training," Wilson added. "Understanding the unique needs some veterans might have, seating preferences that allow them to see entrances and exits, patience with those who might have hearing damage from combat, awareness of PTSD triggers." Lenny nodded, mentally taking notes. "I want to do this right." Across the diner, Harold was still surrounded by his former squad members and a rotating cast of townspeople, stopping by to introduce themselves. Despite his earlier discomfort with attention, he seemed to have found a rhythm now, listening more than speaking, but engaging genuinely with each person who approached. "He's doing better than I expected," Thompson commented to Martinez, as they watched from nearby. "This morning he could barely look anyone in the eye," Martinez nodded. "Being recognized changes a man, being surrounded by his brothers again, even more so." Colonel Wilson approached Harold's table. "Sergeant Mercer, Commander Reed, and I will be departing shortly. Is there anything else you require before we conclude official operations?" Harold stood to address Wilson properly. "No, sir, and thank you. This was unexpected, but meaningful." Wilson smiled slightly. "Operation Respect has many objectives, Sergeant. One of the most important is reconnecting veterans with their communities and with each other." He gestured toward the former squad members. "These connections are vital, especially for Vietnam-era veterans who were denied proper homecomings and recognition." "The program seems effective," Harold observed. "Increasingly so," Wilson agreed, "though we prefer prevention to intervention. Events like today's raise awareness that helps prevent similar incidents in the future." He extended his hand. "It has been a genuine honor, Sergeant Mercer. My father spoke of you often. Meeting you has been personally meaningful." Harold shook the offered hand firmly. "Your father was a good man and a fine officer. He would be proud of what you've done here today." As Wilson moved away to make final preparations for departure, Lenny approached with determination in his stride. "Sergeant Mercer, Mr. Mercer, I have a proposal I'd like to discuss with you." Harold raised an eyebrow inquiringly. "I'm planning to make some changes to the diner," Lenny explained, "creating a space that properly honors veterans and their service. I could use some guidance from someone who understands what would be meaningful versus what might seem performative." Harold considered this. "I'm not sure I'm the right person for that." "I can't think of anyone better," Lenny countered, "and your friends too, if they're willing." He gestured to the squad members. "Different perspectives would be valuable." Martinez grinned. "I like this idea, Sarge. Give us a reason to get together regularly." "A sort of informal veterans advisory committee," Thompson suggested. "Meeting over coffee and pie doesn't sound like a hardship." Harold looked around at his friends, then back to Lenny. The transformation in the diner owner since that morning was remarkable. From hostile rejection to genuine respect and a desire to make amends. "I'd be willing to help," Harold said finally. "Though I should warn you, I have strong opinions about pie." The unexpected touch of humor from the normally reserved man brought smiles all around. "Noted," Lenny replied with evident relief. "And there's something else, a more immediate change." He reached under the counter and produced a hand-lettered sign, the ink still fresh. "Veterans welcome, always." Harold nodded approval. "Simple, direct, sincere. That's a good start." Lenny placed the sign prominently in the front window, positioning it so it would be the first thing visible to anyone approaching the diner. As he did, several people outside noticed and applauded. Inside, the transformation was less visible, but equally profound. Staff members who had previously viewed Harold as just another elderly customer now approached him with respect, listening attentively as he shared stories with his squad. Regular patrons who had witnessed the morning's rejection now expressed shame at their silence and commitment to being more aware in the future, and Harold himself seemed changed, his posture straighter, his eyes clearer, his perpetual tremor less pronounced. The invisible weight of isolation he had carried for decades had begun to lift, replaced by the long-forgotten feeling of belonging. 1 week later, Harold Mercer approached Lenny's Diner with uncharacteristic hesitation. The events of the previous week had been overwhelming, from public humiliation to military intervention to community celebration, all in the span of a few hours. In the days following, he had retreated to the quiet solitude of his apartment, processing the dramatic shift in his visibility within the town. Thompson had called twice, checking in with the persistence only an old friend could get away with. Martinez had stopped by once, bringing a six-pack and decades of stories. But today would be different. Today was the first official meeting of what the local paper had dubbed the Veterans Advisory Committee at Lenny's Diner. As Harold reached for the door, he noticed the changes immediately. The new sign welcoming veterans was now professionally printed and permanently mounted. Beside it, a smaller sign announced, Veterans Coffee Group, Wednesdays 9 a.m., all eras welcome. Inside, the transformation was even more apparent. A section of wall near the entrance had been cleared and painted a deep navy blue. A few framed photographs were already mounted, mostly older veterans from WW and Korea, their service details, neatly labeled beneath each image. A glass display case held medals, patches, and other military memorabilia donated by local families. "Harold, right on time," Lenny called from behind the counter. The diner owner's greeting was warm and genuine, a far cry from the hostile rejection of the previous week. Several of the regular customers nodded or waved in greeting. An elderly couple Harold recognized from the Operation Respect Day smiled broadly and gestured to an empty seat at their table. "Join us, Sergeant Mercer," the man invited. "Unless you're waiting for your committee members." "They should be along shortly," Harold replied, surprised to find himself accepting the invitation. Without hesitation, "And please just, Harold is fine. I'm George Peterson, Army, 52 to 55, the man said, extending his hand. "Korea, nothing like what you went through, but I did my time." "All service matters," Harold said, shaking the offered hand. "This is my wife, Eleanor," George continued. "She had the harder job, keeping everything together back home while I was gone." Eleanor patted her husband's hand affectionately. "We all did what was needed." Jenny approached with coffee and a warm smile. "Good morning, Harold." The others called. "They're running about 10 minutes behind. Traffic on the highway." "No rush," Harold replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. "This is nice, actually." And it was. For the first time in decades, Harold found himself engaged in easy conversation with strangers, now becoming acquaintances, without the weight of hidden identity or unacknowledged service pressing down on him. George was midway through a story about a particularly memorable sergeant from his basic training when the door opened and Thompson, Martinez, and Williams entered together, followed by 3 younger veterans Harold hadn't met before. "Sarge," Martinez called out cheerfully. "Making friends without us, I see." Harold made introductions all around, discovering that George had actually served with Williams's uncle in Korea, another connection in the ever-widening circle that seemed to be forming around him. Lenny had rearranged several tables to create a comfortable meeting space in the corner farthest from the entrance, a considerate touch that acknowledged the preference many combat veterans had for positions where they could see doorways and not be surprised from behind. Fresh coffee, water, and a platter of pastries awaited them. "Before we get started," Lenny said, once everyone was settled, "I want to thank you all for agreeing to help with this. The changes we've made so far are just the beginning." "You've done a lot in 1 week," Harold observed, genuinely impressed by the transformation. "Actually, the whole town's gotten involved," Lenny explained. "Once word spread about what happened and what Colonel Wilson and his team did in response, people started bringing in photos and memorabilia. The hardware store donated materials for the display case. The high school woodshop class is making a custom frame for a flag that was donated. One of the younger veterans, Brian Collins, who'd served in Afghanistan, leaned forward. That's how it should work. Communities supporting their service members, past and present. Wasn't always that way, Williams remarked, his tone matter-of-fact rather than bitter. Especially for our generation. That's changing, Brian replied confidently. My generation of vets won't let what happened to you guys happen again. No matter how people feel about a particular conflict, the men and women who serve deserve respect. Harold studied the younger man thoughtfully. There was something healing about seeing the continuity between generations of service, the same values, the same brotherhood, even across vastly different wars and eras. As the meeting progressed, Harold found himself more engaged than he'd been in years. The group discussed practical improvements for the diner, everything from menu items named after local veterans to ensuring clear pathways for those with mobility issues. They planned events that would bring different generations of veterans together and considered ways to identify and reach out to isolated former service members in the community. We should coordinate with the VA Outreach Office, Thompson suggested. They know who's falling through the cracks, and the VFW, added George from a nearby, having remained to listen in, a lot of older vets who don't get out much anymore. Throughout the discussion, Harold noticed Lenny taking detailed notes, his expression earnest and determined. The transformation in the diner owner was perhaps the most remarkable change of all. From someone who had actively rejected a veteran to someone now fully committed to honoring their service. As the formal meeting concluded and the conversation shifted to more casual topics, Harold found himself surrounded by something he had deliberately avoided for decades: community. Here were people who understood aspects of his experience without explanation, who recognized the weight he had carried and respected him for it rather than pitying him. Same time next week, Lenny asked, as the group prepared to depart. Wouldn't miss it, Harold replied, surprising himself with how genuinely he meant it. Outside, the autumn sun cast long shadows across the street. Harold paused on the sidewalk, watching as his newfound friends dispersed in different directions. Thompson lingered, studying Harold with knowing eyes. How are you holding up with all this, Harold? It's a big change from keeping to yourself. Harold considered the question carefully. It's good, unexpected, but good. Thompson nodded, satisfied. See you Wednesday, then, for the coffee group. I'll be here, Harold promised, realizing as he said it that for the first time in many years, he was actually looking forward to tomorrow. 1 month after Operation Respect transformed Lenny's diner, a formal dedication ceremony was scheduled for the newly completed Veterans Wall of Honor. What had begun as a simple display had evolved into an impressive installation covering the entire back wall of the diner. Nearly 100 photographs now hung in matching frames, each with a nameplate identifying the veteran, their branch of service, and years served. The diner closed early that day for the private ceremony. Mayor Patterson had initially pushed for a large public event with press coverage, but Harold and the Veterans Committee had advocated for something more intimate and meaningful. In the end, the guest list was limited to veterans and their families, with the mayor allowed to make brief remarks but not turn the occasion into a political opportunity. Harold arrived early wearing a freshly pressed shirt and his veteran's cap, now adorned with the service pins Colonel Wilson had sent him. The past month had brought gradual but significant changes to his life. The weekly coffee groups and committee meetings had expanded his social circle beyond anything he'd experienced since leaving the service. His apartment now featured a small table by the window where he and Thompson sometimes played chess in the evenings. The persistent tremor in his hands had diminished noticeably. "Looking sharp, Sarge," Martinez greeted him at the door. "The place turned out something special, didn't it?" Harold nodded, taking in the transformed space. Beyond the Wall of Honor, subtle changes had been implemented throughout the diner. Booth seating had been rearranged to accommodate those who preferred to sit with their backs to walls. A discreet sign near the register informed patrons that a quiet corner was available for veterans who might be sensitive to noise or crowded spaces. The menu now featured dishes named after local service members, with brief stories printed beneath each one. "Lenny really committed to this," Harold observed. "Some folks just need their perspective adjusted," Martinez replied. "Once that happens, they go all in." The diner filled quickly as veterans of all ages arrived with their families. Harold noticed with approval that the younger veterans made particular efforts to engage with the older ones, creating natural connections across generations of service. This intergenerational dialogue had been one of the committee's primary goals, ensuring that the experiences and wisdom of older veterans weren't lost. At precisely 5 p.m., Lenny called for everyone's attention. He stood before the covered wall of honor, visibly nervous but determined. "Thank you all for coming today," he began. "A month ago, this diner was just a place to get a meal. Today, we're creating something more, a space where service is honored, where veterans are recognized, and where their stories are preserved for future generations." He glanced at Harold briefly before continuing, "Many of you know that this project began after an incident that I'm not proud of. I failed to show proper respect to a decorated veteran. What could have ended with justified anger instead became an opportunity for education and growth, thanks to Operation Respect and Sergeant Harold Mercer." A murmur of appreciation ran through the gathering. Harold nodded acknowledgement but remained characteristically modest. "Before we unveil the Wall of Honor, Mayor Patterson has a few words," Lenny announced. Yielding the floor, the mayor stepped forward importantly, but to everyone's surprise kept his remarks brief and genuine. "As mayor, I'm proud to announce that our town council has unanimously approved funding for a veteran support initiative based on recommendations from our Veterans Advisory Committee. This program will identify isolated veterans in our community and connect them with services, social opportunities, and the recognition they deserve." He then presented a framed proclamation establishing an annual Harold Mercer Day of Service, during which community members would volunteer to assist elderly or disabled veterans with home repairs, yard work, and other needed support. Harold, taken completely by surprise, accepted the proclamation with visible emotion. "This should be about all veterans, not just me," he insisted. "It is," the mayor assured him. "Your name reminds us how easily we can overlook the heroes among us. It ensures we never forget that lesson." When the time came to unveil the Wall of Honor, Lenny asked Harold to do the honors. With steady hands, Harold pulled the cord that dropped the covering cloth, revealing the impressive display in its entirety. Center stage was a shadow box containing the American flag that had flown over the diner during Operation Respect, flanked by photographs spanning conflicts from the World War II to Afghanistan and Iraq. Harold's own photo, taken during the ceremony, where Colonel Wilson had presented his long overdue medals, held a modest position among the others, exactly as he had requested. Beneath it was a simple inscription: Harold Mercer, USMC, 1968-1972, Silver Star, Navy Cross, Purple Heart, 2, Bronze Star, Budstevum. As people moved forward to examine the wall, Harold found himself approached by a middle school teacher who had brought a proposal from her students. The 8th grade history class would like to interview veterans for an oral history project, she explained. "We're hoping to create a digital archive of local veterans' experiences. Would you be willing to participate, Mr. Mercer?" A month earlier, Harold would have declined immediately. Now he considered the request thoughtfully. "I think that would be valuable," he said finally, "for the students and the veterans." Later, as the formal ceremony concluded and people mingled over coffee and dessert, Lenny joined Harold at his table. "I've been meaning to tell you something," Lenny said. "I found my father's service records, with Thompson's help and some of the resources Colonel Wilson suggested." "And?" Harold prompted gently. "He received a Bronze Star. I never knew." Lenny's voice held wonder and regret in equal measure. All these years, I blamed the military for breaking him, but I never understood what he did, what he sacrificed. Understanding doesn't change the pain your family went through, Harold said. But it might help you see it differently? Lenny nodded. I've been thinking about creating a scholarship in his name for veterans' children. Something good from all of it. He'd be proud of that, Harold replied. And of what you've done here. As evening fell, the gathering showed no signs of dispersing. Veterans who had entered as strangers were exchanging contact information, making plans to meet again. Families were sharing stories, finding unexpected connections. The diner had become exactly what Lenny's grandfather had envisioned, a true community gathering place where everyone belonged. 6 months after the events that transformed Lenny's diner, the establishment had become a different place entirely. The Veterans Wall of Honor now wrapped around 2 walls, filled with photographs and memorabilia donated by local families. The UA Wednesday Coffee Group had grown so large it had expanded to Tuesdays and Thursdays as well. The Veterans Advisory Committee had become an official town organization, securing grants for outreach programs that identified and supported isolated former service members. Most significantly, Harold Mercer had accepted Lenny's offer to work part-time at the diner as a greeter and unofficial historian. 3 mornings a week, he welcomed customers and shared stories with anyone interested in listening. The transformation in Harold was remarkable. His posture straight, his eyes clear and engaged, his hands steady as he pointed out photographs on the Wall of Honor. On this particular morning, Harold arrived for his shift to find Lenny rearranging tables to accommodate a large group expected for lunch. "Morning, Lenny," Harold greeted him. "Need a hand with those?" "I've got it, thanks," Lenny replied. "The middle school history class is coming in at 11. They're presenting their Veterans Oral History Project. Wanted to make sure we have enough space." Harold nodded approval. He had been one of 20 local veterans interviewed for the project. The experience had been unexpectedly cathartic, sharing his story with young people who listened with genuine interest and respect rather than judgment or pity. "The kids did a good job," he remarked, asked thoughtful questions. Their teachers says your interview was the most popular in the class, Lenny said. Had them riveted. Harold shook his head modestly. "I just told them how it was. No heroics, just the day-to-day reality." "Sometimes that's the most important story to tell," Lenny observed. He had come to appreciate Harold's straightforward honesty, so different from the romanticized war narratives often portrayed in media. The morning proceeded with the comfortable routine that had developed over the months. Regular customers greeted Harold by name. Veterans stopped to chat or point out photographs on the wall. Tourists occasionally asked for stories, which Harold provided with unembellished clarity. At 10:45 a.m., just before the expected arrival of the school group, the diner's door opened and an elderly woman entered slowly, leaning heavily on a cane. She wore a weathered Air Force veteran's cap, and her thin frame seemed almost lost in her outdated pantsuit. Her eyes scanned the room cautiously, taking in the veteran's memorabilia with visible surprise. Harold, speaking with a customer near the counter, noticed her immediately. There was something in her hesitant posture and watchful gaze that he recognized, the habitual wariness of someone accustomed to navigating spaces where they might not be welcome. Excusing himself, he approached her directly. "Good morning, ma'am. Welcome to Lenny's." She regarded him with measured assessment. "Morning. Nice place you have here." "Not mine," Harold clarified with a smile. "But thank you. I'm Harold Mercer. I notice your Air Force cap." "Stationed where?" "If you don't mind my asking." "Korat Royal Thai Air Force Base," she replied. "Vietnam era, name's Catherine Wells. Most call me Kate." Harold nodded with immediate understanding. "Flight nurse?" "Intelligence," she corrected, a hint of surprise in her expression. "Not many folks guess either one, though." "Women veterans are often overlooked," Harold acknowledged, "especially from our era. Would you like some coffee?" "First cup's on the house for all veterans." Kate seemed to relax slightly. "Coffee would be nice. Been driving since dawn." Harold guided her to a comfortable booth, where she could see both the entrance and the Wall of Honor. Jenny appeared promptly with coffee and menus. "Jenny, this is Kate Wells, Air Force Intelligence, Vietnam era," Harold introduced her. "Kate, this is Jenny Simmons, finest waitress in 3 counties and granddaughter of a Marine." "Pleasure to meet you, Ms. Wells," Jenny said warmly. "Can I bring you some breakfast?" As Kate placed her order, Lenny approached the table. Harold made introductions, noting with approval how naturally Lenny welcomed the female veteran, a far cry from his behavior 6 months earlier. "Ms. Wells, we'd be honored to add your photograph to our Wall of Honor, if you're willing," Lenny offered. "We're trying to ensure better representation of women veterans." Kate studied him thoughtfully. "You folks seem to take this seriously." "We do," Harold confirmed. "Took us a while to get here, but we do." Something in his tone made Kate look at him more closely. "There's a story there." "There is," Harold acknowledged. "One I'd be happy to share if you're interested." By the time Kate's breakfast arrived, Harold had given her the condensed version of the events that had transformed the home diner 6 months earlier. She listened attentively, occasionally nodding with the recognition of shared experience. "Sounds like your Colonel Wilson knows what he's doing," she observed when Harold finished. "That Operation Respect program is addressing a real need." "It changed more than just the diner," Harold told her. "Changed the whole town's perspective." "Changed me too, if I'm honest." Kate smiled slightly. "I can see that. You're not carrying it all alone anymore." The simple observation, coming from someone who truly understood, struck Harold deeply. "No, I'm not. Took me 50 years to figure that out, but better late than never." As they continued talking, the diner gradually filled around them. The middle school class arrived, setting up their presentation near the Wall of Honor. Other veterans from the regular coffee group began to appear, each stopping to introduce themselves to Kate. "Quite a community you've built here," she remarked. "It built itself once the right conditions were created," Harold replied. "People want to connect, to understand. They just need the opportunity." When it came time for the students' presentation, Kate joined Harold and the other veterans in the audience. As the young people shared what they had learned through their interviews, Harold watched Kate's expression soften with recognition and remembrance. Later, as she prepared to continue her journey, Kate handed Lenny a faded photograph of herself in uniform. "For your wall," she said simply. "I'll be passing through again next month. Might stop in." "We'll have your picture up by then," Lenny promised. "And there's a veterans dinner on the 3rd Friday. If your timing works out, I might just arrange." "That," Kate replied. Harold walked her to her car. "Safe travels, Kate. It was good to meet you." "Likewise, Harold." She hesitated, then added, "What you've all created here, it matters, especially for those of us who've been invisible for so long." As Kate's car disappeared down the street, Harold stood for a moment in the autumn sunshine, reflecting on how much had changed in 6 months. The diner that had once rejected him had become a sanctuary for veterans of all eras. The town that had overlooked him for decades now recognized and valued his service. And most importantly, the isolation he had imposed on himself had given way to a community of understanding and support. Inside, the students were finishing their presentation to enthusiastic applause. Harold returned to find Lenny already adding Kate's photograph to a space he had reserved on the Wall of Honor. "One more story preserved," Lenny said as Harold joined him. "One more veteran seen," Harold corrected gently. "That's what matters most in the end. Not being forgotten, not being invisible." Lenny nodded understanding. "I won't forget again." Together they turned back to the bustling diner, a place transformed not just by new decorations or menu items, but by a fundamental shift in awareness and respect. A place where the simple act of recognition had created ripples that continued to spread throughout the community, changing lives one story at a time.